Right. So thanks to all of you for joining, and I hope it proves of some interest. This event is particularly exciting for me as it offers me a chance to publicly give my heartfelt thanks to the Irish Tech Society and to the Royal Irish Academy for their generous support of an outreach project that I work on called lave.org, which exists to try to help people read early modern Irish. Without the support of ITS and RIA and the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, it would not exist. And it gives me opportunity also to express my gratitude to the honorand Brendan Abuchla, who was a mentor and inspiration. I hope it's appropriate to share a few brief recollections, and you'll indulge me while I do so. I met Brendan in South Bend, Indiana in 2004. As I was completing my PhD, I received the extraordinary news that I would have opportunity to spend the following year on fellowship at Notre Dame in its Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies. There was much to be excited about in that offer. The chance to meet this towering figure in the field, whose work I so admired, was prominent among them. I desperately wanted to work and discuss ideas with him, but even me and my culturally conditioned American enthusiasm shrunk at the prospect of cold calling the professor to see if he might have interest to talk shop with me. It just seemed a bit too presumptuous, or at the very least too awkward, and so I didn't reach out. It turns out that I didn't have to. A couple of weeks after my arrival at Notre Dame, I was at a small reception. Brendan was there too, and we got to talking, and to my great surprise and delight, he said, "I'd like to read your thesis." As you can imagine, this is something that one does not hear too often. And I was thrilled, if a bit trepidatious. And in that dissertation, I had tried my hand at using some Bardic poetry and Irish material more broadly. And so I was interested to discuss this with him. So language, translation, the movement from Irish language sources to historical argument, all those things I wished to discuss with Brendan. So I printed the thing out, sprawling as it was across roughly 200,000 words, and the good people of Notre Dame got it bound, and I gave it to Brendan. For the next 8 weeks, we would meet one-on-one in his office in Flanner Hall. Brendan on one side of the desk, me on the other. Both of us with our copies of the thesis. And we went through it page by page. Literally, he would sit there and turn pages in front of me and then ask questions. It was absolutely terrifying and utterly wonderful. But that wasn't the total of it. Early on in our meetings, I mentioned my interest in Bardic poetry and in reading early modern manuscripts. You know, I was still kind of working my way, as I still am, through trying to deal with these difficult texts. But I was fascinated by them both and wished to improve. And so again, at his offer, we had a separate session during the week to do language and paleography, which is to say the reading of manuscripts. We would read a few quatrains of something, a manuscript paragraph or two, and then we'd move on. The idea was to get some familiarity with a wide range of documents, styles, hands, forms, genres, and the like. I benefited enormously from Brendan's generosity and deep, deep knowledge, but it was not totally one-sided. I helped him too. For instance, his office had a particularly obstreperous printer, and occasionally I troubleshoot to see why it wasn't responding or why it had jammed. So clearly I got the better out of this whole deal. But, you know, what can I say? I gave to the exchange what I could. After I moved to a permanent job at Connecticut, we stayed in touch, and I would see him at the cafe in Buswell's across the street from the National Library whenever I was in Dublin, and we'd catch up. These were wonderful sessions that I greatly looked forward to. And I imagine that they'd go on for years to come. It still seems unreal that they didn't. So I keep those memories and that inspiration with me and am eternally grateful for them. It's with those conversations about the Irish language generally, Bardic poetry specifically, and the wider world of early modern history in mind that I prepared this talk. It represents an effort to take stock of some of my work over the years and thinking about those topics since those days working with Brendan, and a chance to offer some thoughts about where they might lead from here. For I've continued to be fascinated by those questions that he and I discussed about ideas and behaviors across political boundaries, cultures, and language groups. In addressing them this evening, I want to start with an excerpt from a newspaper article and with what I think is a standard, or too common anyway, image of Gaelic Ireland in the medieval and early modern periods, namely that it was exotic to the point of being unrecognizable to other Europeans. It goes like this. The oldest known map of Ireland will come under the hammer at Christie's sale of fine printed books and manuscripts in New York on Thursday. The first depiction of Ireland as an island in its own right, rather than as part of the British Isles, it is included in a 600-year-old atlas made in Venice by the Italian navigator and cartographer Grazioso Benincasa. Hand-drawn on vellum in 1468, the map was made at a time when Ireland was at the edge of the known Western world, and travel to this country would have been the 15th century equivalent of a voyage to the moon. Okay, I think we can acknowledge that the author knows full well that the analogy is more playful than accurate, and we can respect the need for journalistic style. It is a very good line. Nevertheless, I think we can simultaneously recognize that such lines are symptomatic of a much deeper and complex tension at the heart of doing Irish history of the pre-modern period, namely the notion that it is alien, inaccessible, and best studied through the medium of English. Of the many alien aspects of Gaelic culture in the period, arguably Bardic poetry enjoyed pride of curious place. So what was Bardic poetry? Here it might be easiest simply to quote Osborne Bergen from his lecture on this subject given to the National Literary Society in 1912 and included in his edited collection of sample verse entitled appropriately Irish Bardic Poetry. Quote, "By Bardic poetry, I mean the writings of poets trained in the schools or trained in the Bardic schools as they existed in Ireland and the Gaelic parts of Scotland down to about the middle of the 17th century." So from here on, unquote, so from here on out, I'll be talking about early modern Irish and sometimes classical modern Irish, and which is roughly the iteration of the language as it was written between 1200 and 1650. I'm particularly interested in the 16th and 17th century. So those highly trained poets enjoyed status akin to a king or a bishop, and they were critical political players. Indeed, they were central figures in inaugurations of kings or chiefs, and no such holder of executive power could do so without employing a chief poet. They composed a range of verse. In the political sphere, this included battle roles, inauguration odes, eulogies, and critically satires. More broadly, this included religious-themed texts, ones about houses and territories, about nature and pastimes, and so on. They and their work were foundational to Gaelic society and culture. To outsiders, this all seemed, and for many continues to seem, odd. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons. For starters, the political iteration of this poetry is wildly hyperbolic in its praise, and it's marked by an intense homosocial intimacy, whereby the relationships between poets and kings are discussed in the terms of marriage and lovers. It is also beastly complex and difficult to understand. And there is also simply the curiosity of a political system that puts holders of executive authority into a mutually constitutive and interdependent relationship with composers of verse. That is, one couldn't be a king without a bard, and one couldn't be a bard without a royal patron. I don't wish to deny the uniqueness of those aspects of Bardic poetry and the Gaelic system, but I do want to walk us back from the precipice of lunar analogy and place this work and its practitioners and its audiences in three terrestrial settings. I had promised in the blurb to this talk that I'd focus on Europe, but in the end, I decided to take an approach that defines the wider world as much in chronological as geographical terms, and in doing so, to consider three different things or settings. The first of my wider world contexts is that of the 16th century. This was the age of Tudor conquest, of the professionalization of exoticizing Ireland as barbarous and savage. Here I want to look briefly at high political culture in Tudor England and suggest some points of contact across Ireland, Gaelic Ireland, and England, and how the relationship between verse and state was understood and enacted. My second wider world is Ireland itself. The Ireland that emerged out of loss at the Battle of Kinsale, of the Flight of the Earls, and of the Ulster Plantation, which is to say Ireland after the collapse of the Bardic Order. At some technical level, one could say, I think, I'm willing to argue, that there was no Bardic poetry written after those events, and that strict meter court poetry was reduced to a form, or perhaps a genre, and was not Bardic in the sense of being culturally embedded, socially generative, and sustainable across generations. There was poetry written in the classical meters, but such compositions were not the products of chief poet to king and constitutive of a functioning political order. Rather, they were examples of a time-honored form employed for a variety of purposes that were frequently memorial and self-consciously evocative of days and customs past, say, for instance, in the eulogistic compositions for fallen leaders in the wars of the 1640s and 50s. Nevertheless, in that wider world of anglicized Ireland, Bardic poetry still had a presence, and I would argue did so for elites and commons alike by virtue of an act of translation. And by that, I don't mean linguistic translation, i.e. that people made English renderings of Bardic verse, but rather by its having been translated, incorporated into works of religious instruction, such as sermons and catechisms. My third wider world is where I'll end, and that's the present. A talk sponsored by the RIA and the ITS and named for Professor Buchla seems to call out for some commentary on the place of Bardic poetry in the current scholarly and cultural landscape. This is an exciting time to work on early modern Irish material. In many ways, the resources for learning and researching in early modern and classical Irish have never been more robust or accessible. And here are some examples. This is the amazing Irish script on screen of the Royal Irish Academy, by which you can access manuscripts, the Bardic Poetry Database, hosted by Trinity College Dublin and Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, where you can read this material, the Celt resource at Cork, and most recently, the McMorris Project under Patricia Palmer out of Maynooth. Yet it's also a worrying time in that institutional support for the language and the Celtic languages generally, especially outside of Ireland, continues to erode. And here I just note a news story related to the University of Toronto's recent decision to rebrand their famous Celtic Studies program as a British and Irish Studies one. If we slide continually toward monolingualism, its effects will be ones that touch not only our present cultural world, but also our understanding of the past. I wish to end, therefore, with a few words of boosterism for supporting the study of Irish in all of its historical forms internationally. But first, let me start with the 16th century and the late medieval and early modern context of Bardic poetry. There are a number of ways that one might approach this topic, perhaps most obviously, and what I had imagined I'd do in this talk when I first started pondering it, is to assess the poet's awareness of events and trends beyond the island. To what extent were poets cognizant of happenings outside Ireland, as revealed in the verses they composed? Another approach would be to look for possible effects of those larger contexts on the practice of Bardic poetry itself. Were writers of Gaelic court verse aware of literary conventions elsewhere in Europe? And if so, did that have some demonstrable effect on their work? These strike me as interesting questions and worth investigating, but they also both struck me as approaches that would not address the key concern that I had, namely, how different or similar was the practice of poetry and politics in Gaelic and Gaelicized Ireland relative to other places in Europe. To test that, I simply took some things typically understood as markers of exceptionality, i.e. those things I just mentioned, hyperbole, homosocial intimacy, and the very phenomenon of poets as counselors, and applied them to one contemporaneous setting as a case study. For this, I chose Tudor England, which seemed appropriate given proximity and contact. Taking them in order, hyperbole. It's common to see in Bardic poetry across the medieval period praise of the honorant as rightful king of Ireland. Such encomium is typically ludicrous and for two immediate reasons. First, the king in question might be a rather paltry power in the contemporary firmament, thus rendering the sentiment absurd. Second, however powerful the patron, there simply was no functioning high kingship or pan-insular executive authority for them to assume in any case. As example, we may take the very famous and very brief poem, Brian O'Rourke, Around Damon. Not just quickly read the English. Brian O'Rourke, my choice of lovers, greatest is softness when bestowing valuables, and greatest is hardness in an enclosure of slender spears, the nut of the nut cluster of the Cretan Gaels. Murchu son of Brian, salmon of the Shannon, the image of O'Rourke from Rathtay, or of Neil Callia, who did not refuse any man. He is the cliff teardrop of the guests. King of Calgary of the numerous raids, Tower will be his, abode of the Neils. It was the mouth of Barachan that was saying it. Brian will be king of the ancient plain of Balmum, or Ireland. Now, who am I to say that the ill-fated Brian the Murtha of Breffni, honorand of this poem, was not the equal of those two great figures of the Irish past, Brian Boru and Neil of the Nine Hostages? Whatever the case, though, he was certainly in little danger of ruling over all Ireland. And similar examples are easy to find in the surviving archive, for such grandiloquence was a court poet's stock in trade. For those seeking to access Bardic poetry as a historical source, so somebody like me trained as an historian, this sort of fantasy has fostered suspicion. Can we really rely on such materials to make sense of pre-modern Ireland when its sentiments are so divorced from reality? Perhaps we can't, but if so, it would not be for that reason. For a hyperbolic fancy like this was common across Europe. Again, keeping to England as my comparison, let us consider the monarch in power in 1591, the year of Brian's execution, Elizabeth I. She, like her siblings and forebears, styled herself monarch of France. This was utterly perverse. Now, you might say, yeah, but there was some constitutional blood link to the French monarchy. Fair enough. But Brian and numerous other Gaelic lords had blood links and thus historic claims to the high kingship of Ireland. And moreover, English monarchs and their heralds kept up this fantasy and the inclusion of the fleur-de-lis in their arms until 1802. That's a level of fantasy well in excess of that perpetrated by the poet responsible for Brian O'Rourke Morau Dallin. France, after all, was a sovereign enemy state. I raise this point not to cast aspersions on both political traditions, to castigate their practitioners as fantasists. Rather, I do so to make the simple suggestion that such claims or pronouncements actually did meaningful political and cultural work. Queen Anne, to look a bit ahead in time, who ruled until 1714, may have been in no more danger of being crowned in France as Brian O'Rourke was at Tara. But expressions that they could or should have enjoyed those regal positions served to demonstrate their legitimacy as holders of executive authority and to keep alive and in the public eye ancient claims and political lineages, both constitutional and familial. In both contexts and in many, many similar instances across Europe, such hyperbole was standard fare, a necessary and indeed expected element of political discourse. So it's not that weird. But if the unreality of political claims was not unique to Bardic poetry, perhaps its intense homosocial atmospherics was. That opening line of Brian O'Rourke is arresting. He's the poet's choice of lovers. As many here likely know, the poet-lord relationship was discussed in the language of spouse and lover. And this could be quite explicitly described, as we can see in Angus O'Donnell's installation as chief poet to Phelim O'Toole, head of that powerful Wicklow lordship, in which he writes, Phelim, son of the son of art, accept me as chosen bride. Your beauteous spouse is ample in my eyes, O pledge of Irish hands. And there was a contract between these two legally equivalent parties, one that was represented in the metaphor of marriage, as O'Donnell expressed O'Toole thus. Let us both join our pact together for the duration of our lives. No short covenant, O slender fist, O noble countenance, full and modest. I shall join with the son of Cian a pact which may not be dissolved. Let our mutual love be therein. Let us join our covenant from the heart. Every time I describe this language and these motifs to colleagues or long-suffering friends and family, they are surprised. My undergraduate students, without fail, are always taken aback. It just seems completely inexplicable to them. Yet, minus the contractual language, such expressions of homosocial intimacy were not entirely alien to English poetry. As example, we might take the poetic correspondence between John Donne, yes, that John Donne, and Sir Henry Wotton, a close friend and confidant of Donne's and an important figure in the late Elizabethan and early Stuart court and foreign diplomatic corps. Now, this is not entirely an apples to apples comparison, whereas O'Donnell was writing to cement an official position and doing so with a public audience in mind. Donne and Wotton were exchanging verse letters between them. These compositions were therefore unofficial, but they were not private. Like all such correspondence at the time, be it in prose or verse, it was understood and frequently expected, even hoped, that the readership would be broader. Moreover, like O'Donnell's poem to O'Toole, Donne's and Wotton's to each other were composed against a backdrop of transnational politics. Donne, for instance, wrote the letter in verse known as H.W. in Hibernia Belligeranti in 1599 to Wotton, who had traveled to Ireland in the retinue of the Earl of Essex. In this poem letter, Donne declared that English victory in the conflict, now known as the 9 Years' War, which stalked the island from 1594 to 1603, would not be worthwhile if it meant loss of Wotton's friendship. As he writes, "Went you to conquer, and have so much lost yourself, that what in you was best and most, respective friendship, should die so quickly, or should so quickly die." Or worse yet, that he might lose the love they shared, saying, "In public gain my share is not such that I would lose your love for Ireland." Love here is a variety of friendship, but it is more than a synonym chosen for a variety of expression. For the affective depth of H.W. in Hibernia Belligeranti is also apparent in his earlier verse letters to Wotton, most notably the poems that begin, "Here's no more news," and "Sir, more than kisses, letters mingle souls." These are part of a trio. Donne sent the poem "No More News" to Wotton. Wotton responded with with a poem known as "'Tis Not a Coat of Grey," and Donne wrapped up matters with the poem "Sir, More Than Kisses." These are poems of mutual and unmistakable intimacy, and Donne elsewhere wrote that penning of letters to a friend is, quote, "a kind of ecstasy, and a departure and cessation and suspension of the soul, which doth then communicate itself to two bodies," unquote. Does the masculine register here echo the almost erotic one found in some Irish texts, such as in Brian O'Rourke, Mara Alanan? Perhaps it does, perhaps it doesn't. But my interest is simply to demonstrate that, as with hyperbole of praise, so with expressions of male intimacy, there was a wider world of such sentiment, an expression of which the Irish iteration was a unique part of, rather than exception to. Third, then, I wish to ask, was Irish political discourse unique simply for the fact that it was conducted in large part through verse? The historian Nicholas Canny has noted that Bardic poems are like the Gaelic Irish version of England's state papers, that is, of the enormous archives of letters, reports, proclamations, budgets, and the like that swell the National Archives outside London. It's a wonderful insight and strikes me as correct. Obviously, politics in Ireland was not solely transacted in the form of strict meter verse, but the poems are our best and largest documentary record of Irish power and its exercise in the pre-modern period, putting the Irish archive at odds with its English equivalent. So I've just given you two selections for the Irish archive, or from the English archives on the left, one which is purely textual letter, one in the middle, which is a sort of gathering of accounts, and then on the right is the 17th century copy of the poem I've been talking about, Brian O'Rourke. But if Sir Henry Sidney had his way, the situation would have been very different. Sidney, a man with intimate knowledge of the court, of humanist trends, and of the challenges in navigating court politics from a distance, given his father Henry's long tenure as chief governor of Ireland, suggested that the central question of political counsel was not one of form or genre, but rather one of style. In his defense of poesy, written circa 1580, the younger Sidney queried who was best able to offer political counsel, the philosopher, the historian, or the poet. The first two had their undoubted merits and could claim ancient lineage and exemplars. All the same, both bore inherent flaws that compromised their capacities to advise. Philosophers? They were too concerned with the universal precept and too removed from action in the particular. Historians, they were too focused on the past and exemplars to offer thoughts on the present, or indeed the universal. The poet, however, combined the benefits of both in aiming to describe a best action for the present moment, one that accorded with the universal precepts laid out by philosophers and the instructive precedents brought forth by historians. Here was the true language of informed political observation. And Sidney listed ancient examples across modes of counsel to buttress his point, writing, "So Thales, Empedocles, and Parmenides sang their natural philosophy in verses. So did Pythagoras and Phocylides their moral counsels. So did Tertius in war matters and Solon in matters of policy. Or rather, they being poets, did exercise their delightful vein in those points of highest knowledge, which before them lay hidden to the world." The best means of giving counsel was also the best means to negotiate court, for poetic expression was attentive to the plausible deniability required of high politics. Whereas his father and the various governors of Ireland were captive to the comments they laid bare in prose texts associated with state papers, Sidney confirmed, quote, that there are many mysteries contained in poetry, which of purpose were written darkly, lest by profane wits it should be abused, unquote. Poetry, Sidney declared, had been oddly scorned in English governing circles over recent decades, despite the precedent offered by the ancients and its common use among European contemporaries alike. And its rediscovery was of paramount importance if England were to navigate successfully the demands of governing its expanding empire and weathering the threats of its continental enemies. Given the importance placed upon poetry by such English administrators in Ireland in this period, such as Geoffrey Fenton, George Carew, and John Davies, let alone among such would-be influencers as the poet-soldier Thomas Churchyard and the poet-colonist Edmund Spenser, we might reasonably suppose that his advice was heeded by those charged with overseeing the crown's Western realm. The politics of poetry, or the poetry of politics then, was alive and well in Ireland, in Europe, as Sidney tells us, and it's England that seems the outlier. Given all this, where Irish court poetry might be most unique then is in its political centrality and robustness. Generally speaking, we know that no claimant could be a king without the imprimatur of, and then marriage to, a chief poet, as noted. And we know that satire was deemed to be of extraordinary political and social utility in a system where primogeniture, i.e. the passing of regal or aristocratic authority from father to eldest son, where that was not practiced, and rather acts of regime change were not uncommon. For evidence of this, we may take the famous example of the peace negotiations in 1539 between O'Donnell and O'Connor in their dispute over possession of Sligo Castle. Here is the section on guarantors of the peace, of which there were two: excommunication, which I've bolded, and satire. And just quickly reading the latter, these are the pledges of these contracts on the part of the poets of Ireland, i.e. Connachor Rua Mac Awards, and O'Clery and Fergal son of Donald Rua Mac Awards, and they shall be obliged to satirize Tig, they themselves and the poets of Ireland, as O'Donnell shall demand it of them. That's real power. And we know that English observers were obsessed with that power, and as such made every effort to eliminate bards from the political realm. Thomas O'Reilly's article, Irish Poets, Historians, and Judges in English State Documents, 1539 to 1615, is an extraordinary documentation of how, as he puts it, quote, the English government looked upon the Irish literati with particular disfavor, and time and again punitive measures were put in force against such groups of enemies, unquote. But with that fear also came envy. It certainly did for this guy, Edmund Spenser, the poet, planter, and would-be strategist who could only look upon the cherished place of the court poet in Irish society, in which such status and gravitas held true for him in Whitehall. As such, the relationship between power and verse in Gaelic and Gaelicized Ireland was not exotic in English or even European perspective. Rather, it was a variation on a theme, notable primarily for its prescriptive force. That force would dissipate quickly after the famous setbacks of the early 17th century, the Battle of Kinsale, the flight of the Earls, and the start of the Ulster Plantation. At that point, the wider world of Reformation and Anglicization would utterly transform the political, social, and cultural realities that for centuries had been shaped and structured by the bards. Poetry still had a place in that world, of course, and Mark Cable's research has shown just how creative a moment this was in the history of Irish letters, as more voices came to the fore and did so writing in a much wider range of styles. But as contemporaries, both English and Irish, pointed out, there was very limited bardic input into that cacophony. Poets themselves said this, and there are a number of poems dating from this period bewailing the death of bardic learning, status, and influence, and thus of Ireland itself. Famous examples include Mahon O'Hiffernan's poem Ceist Cide Cheannochach Dawn, and Avik, Nom Yavrig Eigshe, and Fear Flahav Ghanee's composition beginning Bannacht Alman Erin, which detailed the fall of noble families. Those trained as poets but practicing other professions said it too. A. McGangle, the early 17th century Counter-Reformation thinker and Archbishop of Armagh, wrote a long treatise on the sacrament of penance called Scahan Hypermention na Hagratha. In his opening note to the reader, he apologized for the simplicity and poor quality of the Irish in the text, which he explained as a necessary choice given that his goal was to teach about the sacrament, and so the language must be accessible. Now, of the things one could accuse Bardic poetry, simplicity is not one of them. And in writing of the success of Reformed Catholicism in Ireland and MacAngle's role in that success, O'Buachla wrote that, quote, Port Nua vi a cheanam ag MacAngle is a coglacatan, por the vidiri ni an nuchan relicunda wine ag an nuchan noshunta chuma. In the new post-Ulster plantation world and its political realities, a stripped-down, demotic Irish would take the place of formal court verse. English observers, too, confirmed the passing of the Bardic system. Sir John Davies, who held many offices in the colonial regime in Ireland, including Speaker of the House of Commons and Attorney General, and who, I might add, was an avid and accomplished poet, in his Discovery of the True Causes Why Ireland Was Never Entirely Subdued, published in 1612, was so rapturous about this fact that he expressed hope that in one generation's time, the Irish would become, in language, custom, and all other means, English. That silence of the bards must have been profound. Yes, formal Bardic poetry was an intricate production of highly trained practitioners concerned with elite politics, but it was, we must remember, something performed before a broad audience, as this famous woodcut in John Derrick's Image of Ireland reminds us. So in thinking of the wider world of colonized Ireland under the early Stuart kings, I think it's important to bear in mind that while we have numerous examples of written verse, the soundscape and mise-en-scène of Bardic poetry are lost to us. When we read a poem in textual form, the repetition of motifs and the hyperbole of praise can seem little more than bland ornamentation. And this is certainly how some modern commentators have viewed it and condemned it. But its live recitation must have been a full sensory experience, a setting in which the spinning out of time-honored comparisons and illustrative apologues in the face of both ruler and the ruled had a purchase that their textual versions can never convey. In a way, we might think of Bardic performance as we might think of contemporary religious services. At some level, it's not of concern what is said, but simply that it is said and that it is heard and seen, whether one can make full sense of passages from the Vulgate or of quatrains of Bardic encomium. And I believe that if we think of things that way, we can be more understanding of the repetition found in these compositions and more generous to both their creators and listeners. At some very basic level, ritual matters, and poets, like their clerical colleagues, presided over important events in the lives of individuals and communities in Gaelic and Gaelicized Ireland. I don't want to push this analogy too far. There are lots of interesting differences separating Bardic from clerical performance, social roles, and the like. But I at least am not alone in thinking along these lines. Hugh Collier, an Englishman in Ireland writing sometime between 1610 and 1615, I mean, we think he's most likely the author of this, declared that the bards stirred up their audiences, quote, first by praising and extraordinary commending and extolling of the acts of the Irishry, be they ever so wicked, especially such as are and have been either practiced or executed against the English. They stir up their desires and kindle their imaginations and thoughts with such long night to attempt the like as is past compare. And surely their course of proceedings in effecting this is worthy of the considering, for that these extollings are commonly in poetry, and at all their assemblies, either for marriages, burials, or otherwise, their harps must attend and play, and one of these poets or antiquaries sits by, and they procure such attention of hearing as though it had been a sermon. And the emphasis is, of course, mine. As the 17th century progressed, Collier's observation would prove prescient. We have already met A. MacAngle, an archbishop who, although trained in a Bardic school, abandoned the rigors of court verse for a more accessible prose style in his efforts to foster a Catholic Ireland in the face of Anglicization. Or at least he claimed to have done so, for scattered throughout his text on penance are bits of poetry in traditional meter, deployed to hammer home particular points. Similarly, Shahun Caton, or Geoffrey Keating, would make frequent use of bits of Bardic verse in his text Trí Bír Guithan Wash, The Three Shafts of Death, a massive compilation of material on sin and salvation that, as Bernadette Cunningham has demonstrated, was intended to assist priests working in the medium of Irish, through the medium of Irish throughout the island and when writing sermons. Most famous as a first modern historian in Ireland, the author of the Foras Fasa ar Éireann, Caoimhin was also a theologian and a priest. And like McGangle, he received his early education at a Bardic school before traveling abroad to Catholic universities on the continent. All of that training came together in this sermon prep compilation. In it, Caoimhin would introduce a point in his own wording and then prove it by reference to Irish or Latin sources, sometimes both. Typically, this was done in a way that anonymized his source, part of the point being, I think, to create a sense of historical unity in the Irish world on whatever point was at hand. Thus, he would introduce first selections with lines such as Gana Arishin, Der Fila Egan Aransa, Mar Derton Fila Gaelic, Tigan Fila Gaelic Lesha, Mar Nalbers. Other times he named the author. Here's an example that Mark and I worked on with our colleagues Deirdre Nacorg and Emmett Barra. The context is his discussion of the political fallout arising from indulging in various earthly temptations. And after sort of describing this, he says, and you can see there before the poetic bit, as a result of that, Milwater O'Higgin, Archbishop of Tuam, composed this quatrain. And just in the English, God suffers the land of their ancestors, an angelic territory around which a wave closes, under the hegemony of a foreign cohort, because of the overweening pride of the sons of Mio, i.e. the ancestors of the Gaelic Irish. Now, bear in mind that this was offered as something that was to be worked into sermons. Everyone in the congregation, the great and the humble, would hear this. And so in the works of Caoimhin, McGangle, and other practitioners of the Counter-Reformation in Irish-speaking Ireland, Bardic poetry had a new lease on life. It was not so much that those authors were keen to preserve the form or revive the Bardic class or system per se. Rather, they, like Collier, understood the lived immediate power of the experience of a Bardic recitation. However, unlike Collier, they moved beyond simile. It was not that the hearing of Bardic poetry was like hearing a sermon. It was now part of hearing a sermon. And thus, in spite of the collapse of the Bardic order, the dissolution of the poetic schools, and the increasing rarity of composition in classical Irish forms and meters, Bardic poetry continued to play an important and fascinating role in Irish-speaking Ireland, well beyond the collapse of the system that had supported it and which was constituted by it. But does it still? As noted above, the soundscape of Bardic poetry is lost to us. Vestiges of it remained across the 17th century, translated as it was, at least in the hands of Caoimhin, McGangle, and others, into the mediums of the sermon and catechism. But those vestiges dissipated over time, leaving that poetry to live on into the modern era as a manuscript artifact, read by few, understood by fewer. This, I suppose, is hardly surprising. That's how colonialism and cultural imperialism work. But while that forgetting and silence is unsurprising in the realm of general knowledge and public discourse, it is, at least to me, quite surprising that the phenomenon carries over to academic study of pre-modern Ireland too. The vast majority of work on 16th and 17th century Ireland is written in English and constructed out of English sources, either things originally composed in English or Irish materials rendered into English versions. We might grouse about that situation and ask, as many do, whether such a dynamic would be accepted in the study of other societies. Could one be a French historian without knowing French, for instance? But where does that get us? It was with that intention to be part of the solution that those of us involved in the project lave.org got started. The goal was to help people learn to read early modern Irish, thus the project name, which means read or to read. And its initial task was to build out the three necessary resources for doing so. Thus, a grammar, a glossary of terms, which is now connected to Edil, i.e. sort of old and medieval Irish, and a body of annotated selections from different forms and genres. As such, it was in many ways the digital multimodal expression of those weekly meetings with Brenda, wherein the point was not to translate whole text into English, but rather to translate sections and to do so towards the goal of developing a capacity, eventually to abandon translation and simply read them as they were written. And I truly mean as written, for the site now has a paleography primer and quiz. So you can read about manuscripts and how to read them, and then you can quiz yourself. At some point in the not too distant future, we hope to go live with a grammar tutorial. And this is a short little video that our colleague Emmett Barra of TCD put together. And basically, this is a way to test yourself on identifying the correct verb form. And perhaps most exciting, given my discussion tonight of the oral experience of Bardic poetry, we aim to have readings of the excerpts available on the site. But while that work on the site is scholarly in the sense that it is done by people who have professionally dedicated themselves to the study of this material in its context, and then it's supported by scholarly organizations such as ITS, the RIA, and DIAS, and assorted university departments, its audience is imagined to be much larger. For I firmly believe that this material deserves greater readership, and not simply in translation, but in the original. Why? Well, let me offer some wider world comparisons. Imagine what English language cultural life would be like if we couldn't read Shakespeare. Whereas many high school and college students would undoubtedly be delighted not to read The Bard, I think we can agree that cultural life in the modern English language would be less rich. Or to think about this in the political realm. Imagine if Americans couldn't read the writings of the nation's founding fathers, say the Constitution or the Federalist Papers. As a positive, perhaps we could see more clearly out the back windows of our pickup trucks. As a negative, a night at the theater might be less spectacular. Whatever the case, the most obvious effect would be a greatly impoverished political discourse. I'm not here to advocate for Keating's Three Bear Gweehan Wash the musical, but given how Six was so popular dramatizing the stories of the wives of Henry VIII, I'm admittedly intrigued by the possibilities. Maybe some enterprising soul in our midst tonight might be just the person to bring classical Irish court poetry and Counter-Reformation polemic to the stage. That's a wider world situation that I'd like to see. But in the meantime, if we read and celebrate the Bard, why not the Bards? So I've spent the last 40 minutes or so of your precious time attempting to make a case for seeing Irish Bardic poetry, and indeed the Bards, as situated in larger cultural, social, and political contexts, both past and present, within Ireland and without, and legible to a broad range of observers. I hope that my small efforts toward that goal might help in broader and long-standing efforts by the ITS, the RIA, and DIAS to celebrate this material and facilitate greater engagement with it. For, as visualized by what I found a hilarious suggestion from PowerPoint's designer tool for my title slide, Bardic poetry was a terrestrial, not lunar phenomenon, and remains of wide appeal, or at least potentially so. And I know from the Google Analytics reports for Lave that readers plug in from all over the world. But from that global perspective, I wish to come back as a bit of thematic duna of closure to where I started, i.e. at a desk in Flanner Hall at the University of Notre Dame, with Brendan on one side and me on the other, working through text, translations, and arguments. Those were extraordinary hours and collectively were a formative professional experience, but also a personal one, as he taught me much about mentoring, and I remain inspired by his unapologetic advocacy for the Irish language from Sean to Nuan. And I hope that some of the ongoing work I've discussed tonight goes some way to reflecting my ongoing gratitude. Good to meet you.